Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into what might be one of the most dramatic showdowns in all of American history, the presidential election of 1896. Now, this wasn't just any old election. It was a battle for the soul of the country, pitting farmers against financiers, all while the nation was teetering on the brink of collapse.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll set the scene and see why America in the 1890s was basically a powder keg just waiting to explode. Then, we'll meet the two guys who had completely different ideas on how to fix everything. We'll get into their revolutionary campaigns, and finally, we'll see why this one election, from way back when, still tells us so much about how our politics work today.
You know, to really get the fire and fury of the 1896 election, you first have to understand the crisis that fueled it. The 1890s were just a desperate time in America. The country was in the middle of a massive social and economic meltdown, and a lot of people were genuinely afraid the whole system was about to fall apart.
The political mood was, to put it mildly, toxic. The Democrats were in power, so they got all the blame for the country's problems, and they got absolutely wiped out in the midterm elections. I mean, things were so bad that the rich and powerful were seriously talking about whether a full-blown revolution was just around the corner. It really all kicked off with the Panic of 1893. This was a brutal depression that shut down hundreds of banks and threw millions of people out of work. Soup kitchens popped up everywhere, and people bitterly called them Cleveland cafes after the president. You had armies of unemployed men marching on Washington. A massive railroad strike paralyzed the nation, and sometimes turned into literal violent warfare. It was chaos.
So out of all this turmoil, a brand new political star appears on the scene. He was young, he was charismatic, and he was pushing a pretty radical idea that he claimed would save the common man from the clutches of the rich and powerful.
Okay, so at the time, America's money was on what's called the gold standard. Basically, every dollar was backed by a tiny bit of real gold. This kept money stable and valuable, which was awesome if you were a banker or a business owner in the East. To them, this was sound money. It was safe. But if you were a farmer out west or down south, the gold standard felt like a death trap. See, you were buried in debt, and the prices you got for your crops kept falling, making it impossible to pay anyone back. Your solution? Something called free silver. The idea was to just start minting tons of silver coins. That would create inflation, which would drive up crop prices and make those crushing debts way easier to pay off. And this right here, this lays out the battle lines perfectly. This wasn't just about money, it was a culture war. It was the industrial, big city East versus the rural, debt-ridden South and West. You're looking at two completely different Americas fighting for two totally different futures. And then came the moment that changed everything. With this one single, sundering line, a 36-year-old guy from Nebraska named William Jennings Bryan just electrified the Democratic Convention. His Cross of Gold speech became an instant legend. And just like that, he became the leader of the Free Silver movement and the Democratic nominee for president. So, on the other side of this passionate crusade, you had the Republican Party, and they offered a very different vision, led by a very different kind of candidate. Their guy was William McKinley from Ohio, a Civil War vet, an experienced governor, a real establishment figure. They called him the High Priest of Protection because he loved high tariffs. And the man behind the man was his best friend, Mark Hanna, a super rich industrialist and, as it turns out, an absolute political genius who had been planning this for years. The Republican message was simple, and it was powerful. They promised they'd bring back prosperity by sticking to the gold standard and by putting up high tariffs to protect American businesses. And, of course, they blamed the Democrats for everything and painted Bryan as this wild-eyed radical who was going to wreck the whole country. McKinley wasn't just a candidate. He was, as they put it, the advance agent of prosperity. All right, so let's get to the campaign itself, because this thing was legendary. It wasn't just a clash of ideas, it was a clash of two totally different styles of campaigning, a showdown that would really write the rulebook for modern politics. And you can see the difference right here. It is just night and day. Bryan, running on a shoestring budget, he went out to the people. McKinley, on the other hand, he stayed home and let his massive campaign machine bring the people to him. It was the ultimate showdown, grassroots passion versus big money organization. I mean, you have to appreciate the sheer energy of Bryan. He crisscrossed the country, traveling 18,000 miles by train. He gave something like 600 speeches, sometimes more than 20 in a single day. He was an absolute force of nature, using that incredible voice of his to whip up huge, enthusiastic crowds. But for all of Bryan's energy, McKinley had money, and I mean a lot of money. Mark Hanna built the most powerful, well-funded political machine anyone had ever seen. He basically went to all the big corporations and banks and said, "Open your wallets." And he used that cash to flood the country with millions of pamphlets and posters. He even hired his own army of speakers to follow Bryan around and counter his message. And this is where Hanna was just brilliant. He knew that Bryan's biggest strength, his passionate focus on free silver, was also his biggest weakness. The Republican message of prosperity and protection was easy to understand. By making Bryan defend this complex economic theory over and over again, Hanna made him look like a one-trick pony, a dangerous radical. He controlled the conversation.
So, after this epic battle, money versus oratory, the establishment versus the upstart, who won? And more importantly, why are we still talking about an election from over 100 years ago?
Well, the winner was McKinley, and it was a pretty clear victory. If you look at the results, you can see Bryan cleaned up in the rural South and West. But McKinley absolutely dominated in the industrial Northeast and Midwest, where most of the people lived. The future of the country, urban industrial America, was on his side. Yeah, this was a big one, a real turning point election. It settled that whole money debate, for one. It kicked off a long period of Republican control of the White House, and it pretty much killed off the Populist Party. But the biggest thing, the thing that really lasts, is that it completely changed how you win a presidential election in America. That strategy that Mark Hanna pioneered, raising a massive war chest of cash and using it to blanket the country with a disciplined, centralized message, that became the playbook. His role as a kingmaker was so effective that 100 years later, the top political minds in the country were still openly copying his methods. And that really leaves us with this final thought, doesn't it? The election of 1896 basically framed a conflict that is still at the absolute center of our politics today. The power of a passionate, grassroots message versus the overwhelming power of a well-financed professional machine. It's a battle that plays out in almost every election, even now.